approximately 1 hour, with 25 minutes for presentations and the remaining time for Q&A. For those not familiar with this webinar software, or for those who've recently joined, all participants are on mute, so we don't have too much background noise. You all should be able to follow along on your screen the PowerPoint presentations. After we listen to the presentations, you can either raise your hand by clicking the hand icon or submit a written question via the question box at the bottom right side of your screen. If you submit a written question, I'll read it out on your behalf during the Q&A period, noting your name. If you raise your hand when we get to you during the Q&A period, I'll unmute you so you can ask your question. Please submit questions through the chat at any point during the presentations. We'll be recording this webinar and we'll post it to the IVP website. There will also be a brief survey at the end of the webinar, which we would be grateful if you could fill out. Again, many thanks to Brett and Memo and to all of you for joining today. So without further delay, it's my pleasure to pass on the microphone to Brett Davison. Go ahead, Brett.
Okay, I'm hoping you can all see my screen.
Yes.
Great. Somehow it's 1 second. There we go. Okay, so I want to talk first about why actually bother engaging the media. And I think the first thing is, many people in organizations that are doing the kind of work that you're doing spend a lot of money on projects, on research, on getting reports ready and so on, and then often there's not budget for communications and for media. But I think, it really is important, because it's no point that all the good work is sitting on a shelf and not getting out there. And I want to just highlight some of the reasons that you need to invest and really spend time investing in the media. So the first one is really that the media set the agenda. Basically, the media influence what people in the public think about. And if the issue, in your opinion or perspective, is not in the media, people will not be thinking about it. The second thing is that media frame the debate. So they set the terms of the debate. And they affect the public's understanding of social issues. So again, if you want to have an influence, you need to be in the media and where people are discussing things. There are a number of other reasons. I mean, you might want to add a particular voice to the discussion. Often I've seen this, particularly with budget and economic stories, when it's often the business community that's writing about it, business reporters writing about it, or from the perspective of the rich or the middle class, and so that means that that's what government is responding to. It's those issues, because that's what's predominating in the media. So if you want to add a voice and a perspective, you need to be in the media and be able to do that. You might want to name and shame things that are going wrong, for example. You might want to also gain public support for your campaign or for your issues. So there are many reasons that you might want to be in the media, but I think it's very important that you need to be clear about your goal, because that will really determine your approach. And you can't do everything, and you need to know whether you've succeeded, because obviously being in the media is not the aim. The aim is to have an impact. So if you don't know what you're trying to do, you won't know if you've really had that impact in the end. Okay. So important thing is, I think, when you're thinking about getting into the media, is how to think like a journalist. Because if you think like a journalist, you'll learn to understand what interests journalists and how you can interest the media in your issues. So there are a number of very, very familiar things that I think to think about when you're thinking about thinking like a journalist. The one is timing, right? They have to be new. They have to be relevant for that time. It can't be old. News is like what's happening now. It's new. So your information has to be new. It has to be something that's different. It has to be significant, right? The journalists are looking for something that's going to really be important. So how can you make people think that, and see that the issue that you're talking about is significant? Proximity is also something really important. Something that's near is more important than something that's far away, right? We know, for example, when a plane crashes, every country wants to know where our citizens on that plane. So basically, the closer it is to people, the better it is for you. Human interest is really important, and I'll talk a bit about this again later. You know, how does it impact people? Let's hear people in the stories, not just dry numbers. Of course, something unusual always gets the attention of a journalist, and then it also really helps if it's visual, particularly if you want to be on the internet or if you want to be on television, you need some visual interest. But also just in print, visuals can really have an impact. But I want to also highlight another few things. I mean, one is, every journalist has a particular audience in mind. Every media outlet knows exactly who their audience is, whether it's teenagers between the ages of, 18 and 21, whether it's housewives, whether it's working people. Every journalist knows who is their audience member and who they're writing for or producing for. And so you also need to understand that and understand which audience they're catering for and how to tailor your message for that particular audience. Then journalists are generally intimidated by numbers. There's a lot of research done to show this. They don't really feel they understand economics issues. Often people are intimidated by budgets and numbers, so you really have to make it easy for them to understand and really put it into terms that they can grasp easily. Time is a precious resource. Newsrooms have been shedding staff. The media are under pressure for all sorts of reasons. There's not money. So journalists are covering a number of stories at the same time. They don't have time to invest in investigating. And so often they'll actually just take material you give them and print it. They'll take press releases and just maybe change a couple of words and use them. And there's a term for this called churnalism. They just churn these things out. So the more that you can actually give them ready-to-use material, the better it is for you. Now, news needs events and it needs people. Journalists often struggle to cover issues, broad issues. They need an event to tie it to, and they need people to feature and to talk about and to talk to. So you need to think about how you can provide both. How can you create an event or link your issues to an event that's already happening? And can you provide them with people? People who are affected by the issue, people who can speak about the issue, people who can speak well. And if you can provide those two things, you can really have more success. Of course, your story has to compete for space and attention. There's more media than ever out there. We all know that everyone's watching cat videos, but not, cat videos get the most attention. So, how can you get attention for your story? And often because people think budget stories or finance stories are really dry and boring. And if you have a look at the website Upworthy, they really have done a good job in this, in making sure that videos that are dealing with important social issues get lots of attention. And they do that by making catchy headlines. And I'm sure you've come across things like, watch this video and you wouldn't believe how this woman responds when someone challenges her. They make the headlines so that you really have to click it and see what happens. So how can you do that as well for your story? And then for journalists, good sources are crucial, and so are good quotes. So if you can make sure over time that they see you as a really reliable source that will help them, not only when you want something, but when they need something, and if you can provide good quotes, good sound bites, short, pithy quotes that have an impact, you're halfway there. And I want to talk about a few common mistakes. I mean, one is that, thinking that because the issue is important and you think it's important, the media should cover it. No journalist is going to cover an issue because you think it's important. You have to show them why it's important for them and why it's relevant for them and their audience. And then not meeting the audience where they are. The audience don't have your training and understanding of budget issues. They don't understand the language you speak. You need to really understand how the audience thinks, what are their daily concerns, and meet them where they are. Think about your grandmother. How would you explain and get your grandmother understanding issues? Again, not investing in the necessary time and resources. It takes time. You need to cover the media. You need to follow the media. You need to know what's happening. You need to be in touch, and this takes time and resources, investing in those resources. Not just sending out the media your 35-page report without taking the time to condense something into a 1 or 2 page brief that they're more likely to pay attention to invest in visuals. And really, you need that because it will pay off later. Not building relationships. Media relations are about relationships. The more that you can build relationships with journalists over the long term, you're really going to have more success. And then don't give up too soon, and be sure to follow up. I've for example, spent a long time trying to get a story into a major newspaper in South Africa, and it took me months, but eventually I got there. And it was because every week something more important kept happening, and they kept bumping me off. But you just have to keep at it. You need to, as I said, prepare ready-to-use materials. Don't overwhelm people with information. Give the relevant information. What's useful at that point. Journalists, again, as I said, don't have much time. Don't believe that the evidence speaks for itself. You have to show why it's important. You have to show what your research means and why it's significant in the context. And then you need to link it often to issues that are current or current news, right? So if something's happening elsewhere in the country or in the world, how can you link your issue to that and link it to concerns that issues that people are already talking about? And that'll give you much more success. And please remember that the facts are not enough. You might think that your brief, your chart, your research really speaks for itself, but the evidence shows, and lots of research shows, that emotion trumps reason in human decision making. People do not make decisions, politicians do not make decisions based on reason. Everybody makes decisions based on emotion. And there's, for example, very many examples of, for example, patients who've lost the emotional center of their brain, and they cannot make decisions because they can list the cons, they can list the pros, but they cannot decide which. Every decision needs an emotional trigger. And so you need to figure out how you can bring that emotion in. How can you make people care and care about the issue and in a way that's going to make a difference. And one way to do this is to tell a story, tell a human story before a particular story about a particular person before zooming out to tell the big picture. And a good example is of a doctor in Georgia in the United States who was trying to argue for budget, that the state legislature should budget for a trauma unit for children. And he'd made the argument many years and provided evidence and what the impact it could have and so on. But it was only until there was a particular story about a child whose father drove over the child when rushing out to buy a Christmas present one Christmas. And the child could not be saved because there was no trauma center. And when he told that story to the lawmakers, they passed the bill and they passed the budget for trauma centers. And so the evidence didn't make any difference. It was that particular story that moved them and then made them look at the evidence in a new way. I've experienced that myself in Malawi when we tried to get journalists to cover a story on social cash transfers, and we were able to take them to interview a particular woman who was using the transfers. The argument was that, oh yeah, we don't give people handouts because it makes them dependent, and we were able to tell a particular story of a particular woman who was using a cash transfer in a pilot project to invest in a small business. She was employing other people, she was taking care of her family, and that really had an impact, and that became a feature in a number of newspapers that week. And then make it visual. Visuals can really help you tell, really make sense of some complex information and help people navigate it in an easy way. And I've put the address there of a great resource, which is visualizingadvocacy.org. There's a book that you can get for minimal cost or free if you write a blog for them. There's a website you can use about how NGOs can really make use of visuals. Create your own events that are media worthy. Don't expect that journalists are just going to come to your press conference because it's a press conference. How can you create an interesting event that people are going to come to? And there are great examples like this. There's a website called actipedia.org, which you can have a look at, full of creative activism examples. But one example is, for example, Billionaires for Bush, where activists dressed up as rich people and hung out outside political conventions and said had signs saying, "We're billionaires for Bush." And it was interesting, it was weird, and journalists covered it, and it helped show without argument that Bush was working for billionaires and not for everybody else. And then think about, is the issue that you're trying to talk about a scandal, and how can you help journalists to see that it's a scandal? And a great campaigner for Greenpeace, Chris Rose, has a formula. He says scandal equals something that's awful plus avoidable. So it's awful, but it doesn't have to be there. It can be avoided if the government does something different, multiplied by the amount of immoral profit someone's making. And if you can highlight those things, you can highlight why it's a scandal and really get journalists interested. You need to control the message. You need to be sure that you're in control of your own message. And language is really important here. There's studies that show, for example, the metaphors you use influence how people think of it. And research has shown, for example, that if you talk about crime as a virus, people who hear that language then think about solutions in terms of prevention. So crime is infecting our communities. People then think about prevention solutions. Whereas an article that talks about crime as a beast that's invading our communities and tearing our communities apart, people think of punishment solutions. Let's jail people. Let's have zero tolerance. Another example is in Britain, with the government arguing for austerity. They're using the argument of the government, the national credit card is maxed out. They use that metaphor. And so there's no alternative but to cut back. And so if you're trying to use that metaphor, you're going to lose the the battle because they're using that and it's powerful. So how can you frame it differently with a different metaphor? So an example is you might want to talk about the economy is like a casino, where it's a gamble, and people are gambling away our money with no responsibility. So think about the metaphors and the language you can use, which really gets your message across. Make numbers and quantity tangible. Think about how you can compare numbers and quantity to concrete things. If we were to do this, someone's wealth, if it were to be bricks, it would reach from here to the moon. Really make things visible and tangible for people. Speak in the singular. When you're talking about how people are affected, don't talk about mothers or poor people. Talk about the worker who is going to work from, in Soweto every morning is going to have a problem paying for his taxi. Talk about the singular. And then profile the actors. Often when it comes to the economy in particular, we talk about it as if it's this thing that exists like a god outside of us. Nothing that anyone can control. And so, for example, the economy, we have to do this because of the economy. The markets are telling us we have to do that. So bring it down to the concrete, because it's all about people who are making decisions that affect other people. Profile the actors, make sure we know who the actors are and what are their actions that they're taking that are making things the way they are today, and then profile who it's affecting and how that can be changed. Handling an interview, prepare your talking points. Make sure you know what you're going to be talking about, and really keep these limited to a few talking points. The screen is obscuring my slides. I think the other thing is, remember that you don't have to answer the question that you're asked. Often people get interviewed by journalists and they say, well, they didn't ask me what I wanted to talk about. Well, you don't have to answer the question. You can really use a bridging tactic, which all the skilled politicians, for example, use. So you can say that, yes, that is an important issue, but actually what our research is showing is that. Or, well, some people are talking about that, but what we really want to focus on today is this. And so you bring the point back to the issue that you're trying to highlight. I wanted to just highlight a great, a story that a couple of years ago that some organizations in South Africa highlighted about the state of hospitals in South Africa. And it was partly a budget story. It was partly a story about corruption and a number of other things. But, they produced a supplement, and they really did a good job of highlighting the people involved. I mean, they talked about the budget issues, they talked about the policy issues, but they also profiled the people, the patients, the staff, the policymakers, and so they told a great story that really, I think, told the full story. So what makes a good budget story? A single clear message, meet the audience where they are, use good visuals and quotes, tell a story, tell a story with your numbers or with your research. Tell people, what's happening, create that bigger picture. Produce memorable visuals and quotes, make things concrete, link decisions and actions by people to impacts on people. Make sure it's timely, relevant, and fresh, and then highlight problems as well as, of course, highlight your solutions. Often, there's a lot of research, for example, to show that particularly left-wing think tanks often highlight problems and don't often highlight solutions, whereas the right-wing tend to be very good at highlighting solutions, and we want to be able to highlight solutions. Okay, so that's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Brett. We are going to have a 5-minute period for Q&A for anything burning from the floor, any direct questions to Brett before we move ahead with our next presenter. Feel free to raise your hand so I can unmute you and you can ask your question directly, or feel free to post your question on the chat box. There is a question from Ryan here at IVP. Brett, how should media work be built into other work?
Okay, so maybe you might want to say a bit more about what, maybe expand on that question a bit. I think, think about media right from the start. So often, you know, people do all this work and then say at the end, oh, okay, how can we get media? But actually, if you involve, you know, thinking about from the start, how can we, what is going to become of this? I think it helps you actually think about even how you do your research differently. For example, you might want to, when you're out doing research, be gathering stories in the field so that it doesn't come at the end and you think about, oh goodness, how can we tell human stories? So I just think, you know, if you have lucky enough to have a communications person, think about them, involve them from the start. But if you don't, just be thinking about media really from how can you integrate that. I don't know if I can be more specific. But think about what you want to do within the end. You know, think about who your audience is going to be and how you can get it out there in a number of formats.
Thank you. Kenneth Weston, did you want to ask something? You are unmuted.
Yes.
Go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yes,
Okay,
go
thank you.
ahead.
I wanted to ask that what does he mean when he say meet the audience where they are?
Okay, so what I mean is that you know, we work in the nonprofit world. We have a particular language and jargon, or we have particular expertise. You know, we talk about budgets and the economy in a certain way. You know, but the audience, we forget the audience is not us, right? We need to. They don't necessarily have our education. They don't necessarily understand what a gross national product is, or you know, or even what like a percentage means. So think about really who your audience is and what are their daily concerns, you know, and how can you address those and kind of talk in a language that makes, you know, that they can understand, but also address things in ways that are relevant for them. So what does the budget mean for you, when I'm a working mother, single mother, trying to make ends meet? Or for a journalist, you know, the journalist is covering a number of stories. How are you going to make that journalist realize that your story is important? And think, so what is that journalist thinking about? How can I get a good story and look good for my editor? How can I make sure my story gets into the paper or the television broadcast when there are other journalists competing with other stories? You know, how can I cover the story when I don't have budget to get to the area, to the press conference? So think about those concerns of a journalist and how can you address them? You know, also, you know, think about communication is about sending information, and it's also about receiving. You know, and if the reception doesn't happen, you haven't succeeded. Just because you communicate doesn't mean your audience gets the message. You know, I live in New York and I travel in the subway, and often I'm sitting in the subway and you can hear that the driver's making an announcement, but I cannot hear what on earth he's saying. And I know that he's talking and he thinks that everybody is hearing that, oh, the train is not going to leave, you have to get out the train because, you know, it's a problem. But we don't hear him because the system is broken. The microphone is not working. There are people talking in the train, and I often think about that in the terms of NGOs trying to communicate. We're in that booth with a train driver, thinking we're announcing and everyone's hearing our message, but in fact we're not realizing that they're not hearing and understanding it all. So unless you put yourself in the place of the audience and realize what are the obstacles to getting the message, you're not going to be successful.
Great, thank you very much. We're going to now move ahead with the program, and we're going to hear from Guillermo Noriega, Director of Sonora Ciudadana, and after we hear from Memo, the rest of the time will be all for Q&A. So please, Memo, go ahead. We can hear you now.
Trustee, yes, thank you very much. Well, I want to thank IVP for the invitation. Well, to share with you some of the learnings around how to communicate complex situations, especially complex findings or complex results of budget analysis. I work for an NGO in the north of Mexico and coordinate a network nationwide. And in my job, I often face these issues. Great findings with huge problems to be communicated. The problem is that budget arguments are complex and they are difficult to understand for most of the people, especially, and also to the journalists, and a lot less attractive than everyday breaking stories. Nowadays, NGOs around the world have lots of experience doing research. We build strong budget arguments, but we face difficulties on how to engage them to a media strategy. There's a couple of additional problems. First, public opinion is crowded. It has been crowded, it's crowded now, and it will be crowded every day in the future. Second, decision makers and most of the audience have a problem with attention when it comes to public finance and numbers. So we are forced to communicate them the best as possible. This is how it looks like the result of a good research in an NGO nowadays. We even feel excited when looking something like this, but it's awful. We still don't get it, and most organizations don't get it. Most of journalists won't see everything we see in this table. We have to sell our findings. If you're planning to go public, let me share with you some of our learnings, but first, one advice, 2 short stories, and then some other advices, and I will be brief. If it's too complicated to tell, show. Get involved with some designers and drink together. Convince them of your cause. Images are very powerful tools, and we must use them to connect to people. Here, for example, is an online request to Governor Medina of the state of Nuevo León, in the north of Mexico, to sign a bill allowing medicine and treatments to
Hello, everyone. If you can hear me, we will address this sound issue in a second, and we will restart promptly. I apologize for the inconvenience.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me now? Rocio, I can't hear you. Can you hear me now? Hello? You should be hearing me now.
Memo, can you please speak so we can make sure that we can hear you again?
Now, yeah, can you hear me now? Can you hear me now, Rocio? I'm talking. Can you hear me? It's weird. Can you hear me now? Hello, I can hear you, Rocio. Can you hear me now? Rocio? Rocio, can you hear me? Hello?
Memo, please continue. We can hear you. Go ahead.
Thank you.
You need to go back a few slides.
Okay, I was about to start chatting and finish my. Thank you. Well, I was saying that perhaps.
I think you need to go back to the slide where the picture with a green banner. Yes.
That's well. Well, I hurry up then. Well, this is an online request to Governor Medina of the state of Nuevo León to sign a bill allowing medicine and treatments to some citizens. They were discriminated. We advocated on the state Congress for that law to pass and already demonstrated the financial viability of this bill. But still, Governor wanted to veto that law. Well, we had to shorten all the whole story and bring all the message to just one. Veto kills, and leaving those people without treatments that could be awful for their health and their lives. I'm going to jump to this one and try to talk about accuracy in one argument and selling one argument strongly with strong communications possibilities. If you say, go to media and says government wants to increase public debt 153.58% this year, perhaps that's great for a paper or that's great for a specialist table discussion, but it's not okay to go to media with that. It's better to come and bring something like government proposals to increase public debt. If passes, Mexicans to be born this year with all already 50,000 pesos. That kind of switching of perspective on how you say the same thing could help you to bring public and engagement to your cause. It's not, stories must have faces and names And as well as budget stories, for instance, it's better to talk to Abel around Abel's history and his wife. They were discriminated in a public health institution in Sonora because when he arrived, he was already, he had a pre-existing condition. We fought for this, and but it's better to talk about his history and how he fought to be not discriminated and receive his meds and treatments, or to talk about Patricia's father, who died in a public hospital waiting to be treated. We had all the numbers, we had all the research done, we had everything, but we had to switch how we presented this issue, and we called the campaign the Rebellion of the Ill. This way, we had better ways to say, hey, this public institution is killing me. They are refusing the health services to those with pre-existing conditions. Please denounce them. Please speak up. So all these campaigns helped us to put names, histories, and feelings and emotions to one budget argument that we already had demonstrated it could be possible. Here, for instance, we printed some postcards, and depending on the public and who we wanted to have impact on, we used some arguments or others. Here you can see a government office. Governor's office is on the penthouse. They will be paying over 100 million pesos next 24 years, but yet they refuse medical attention, treatments, and medicines to some people due to financial reasons. So to finish this example, we could address this issue, we could have addressed this issue through different perspectives. Discriminatory rules, yes. Public spending, public financing, and public and health financing, human rights violations. There's no correct answer, but we all use all of those perspectives depending who we wanted to impact. But there's something important to say. When going to the media, the human side of the story is even better. And I'm going to close with the second example, and it's about back in 2003 when I was working at Fundara, a national organization. We found that a House of Representatives reallocated $30 million from women's health programs to a conservative anti-abortion private organization. His name was Provida, pro-life in English, and in 2004, thanks to the Right to Information Act, we obtained all the invoices and discovered a huge fraud. We found they spent money in diverse issues, but they not only paid for luxury pens or ballrooms or parties, for instance. We found invoices of lingerie, and obviously found a huge fraud with fake invoices. The question was in that moment, how can we communicate this huge fraud, and what's the best perspective of it? Obviously, the fraud itself is a great story. Illegal allocations is a great story as well. Lack of effective legislation to avoid this from happening. Obviously, that could be, and women being affected by this decision because the $30 million originally were for health programs for women. And we used all of them. And we tried to put everything in a box and just communicate everything and split it all out. If I had to ask you what's the perspective or what happened in the public, opinion is that this case is called the Tonk Gate, El Tanga Gate in Spanish. We didn't want that, but anyway, we didn't control our message as we needed, and media did it. Media took what was the sexiest perspective, the most engaging perspective, to say how come a conservative organization that is against abortion and against having sexual relations before marriage is expending public resources on tongues. So I bring this to as an example because we didn't really think that was going to happen when we presented it. It was a huge success. Even now, people remember this. And however, the success we had, we learned a lot. Well, we're talking about 12 years ago. I'm finishing. One advice I will always have to say is follow-up plan. Have a follow-up plan. This means we are very excited with our findings. We go public, and always journalists go with this huge and terrible question: and what are you going to do next with your findings? Are you going to do advocacy? Are you going to have meetings with representatives? Are you going to call for demonstration, taking legal action? What are you doing? And sometimes we always respond everything or anything when it comes to our mind. Try to have a plan. Planning is practical, is the key of success in these things. And let me finish with a summary. You do have to mind the context. Public opinion is crowded. Make it as simple as you can. Focus on your main objective and use the most attractive perspective to communicate. Attractive not to you, attractive to the people, to the public. If it's complicated to tell, show it. Images are very powerful. If it isn't relevant for them, make it relevant. Try to sell your story. Lobby them with columnists and journalists before you go out. And well, try to tie your agenda to the media agenda. Journalists, they don't work for you. You don't work for them. They do have an agenda. You do have an agenda. We'll try to tie them up. And well, the final thing is try not to be famous but effective. And that's this. If I have time, I would love to explain it more to you. But I'm going to finish right here.
Thank you very much,
And I'm sorry because of all the complications. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Memo and Brett, for this excellent examples and key points to consider when engaging with the media and reporting our budget stories. Now the floor is yours. Feel free to type in your questions in the chat box, or feel free to raise your hand so we can unmute you and you can ask your questions directly. Both Brett and Memo are now unmuted so they can react to your questions. Okay, we have Anna Schnell. She says, what is your audience to someone who is formulating a message to a journalist? A message that is not spectacular in any way, no scandal, no corruption, no major finding, really. The main message is just this time-specific information that people reading specific news sources need to know about, but may not be super interested in.
Well, I mean, one question is, so, you know, why do they need to know about it? You know, who needs to know about it, and why they need to know about it? And is that a reason that you can then sell to a journalist or to a media outlet to cover? You know, how can you get people to take notice of it? Is there an interesting way that you can talk about it? You know, but I think also this is also about, you know, that building of relationships. So that, you know, so that if you build that relationship with a journalist and actually you help them out, even when you don't necessarily have something specific to put out there, when there is something that you want to communicate, you can do that. You know, and I think if you build, you know, there are journalists out there that are good, that are serious, that want to cover serious issues in a serious way. And so if you have that relationship, then if you have something that really, you know, it's nothing like spectacular, you can say, look, call them up and say, look, you know, there's this issue that's going on right now, and I really think you need to communicate this aspect of it. And they would be open to that. So I think it's also all about those relationships.
Would you like to?
You know, you know, there's other ways to get information out there, right? So you don't actually, not only through journalists writing about it, but you can use things like letters to the editor, which, you know, people often do to get points across in response to, you know, issues that are being covered by the media. There are many online resources that you can use as well. So, you know, other things like Twitter, you know, I mean, I didn't mention Twitter, but Twitter in many countries, that's where journalists are now getting their news from often. And so even if you're like regular people aren't on things like Twitter, in some countries journalists are really watching Twitter to see where they can get news. And so think about a number of ways that you can get attention to your issue.
Ryan, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thanks very much, Brett and Guillermo. I found both your presentations really interesting and useful. One thing that you both said that I really felt in my experience works or can be a thing that works very well is to find somewhere personalizing the story and putting a human face to it. And I just wanted to, I mean, I'm thinking through how this works in terms of a budget story. It'd be great to hear your guys' perspective on that, and also from the rest of the audience, how they've found that has worked. In my experience, when I was working for a human rights organization, we had a campaign on cross-border justice. That was a fairly sort of technical issue. It was about extradition, and not enough safeguards in place in Europe between extraditing people from one country to another. And we had this campaign going for a long time, but it wasn't really until we found someone. It was actually an elderly grandmother who was being sought by France for marijuana charges that happened in the 60s, and she was going to be extradited from the UK to France. We found this person, and then the campaign became a media story. So I just sort of wanted to underline that you might have a campaign, and you need to look for the timing and having your ducks in a row, and an opportunity might come up that makes something into an issue. So that story went around the world once we identified her and prepped her to be able to talk to the media. You know, she was the story, but we were able to use her experience to talk about the wider issues, which was extradition. So yeah, I just wanted to relate that, but I wanted to sort of ask other people what their experiences have been in kind of getting a face for your campaign, really.
Any comments or reactions to Ryan?
Yes. Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes. Go ahead, Memo.
Okay. Thank you. Well, I agree. It's not the same when you have a cause and you have an argument, and even if you have a budget argument and try to communicate it, and you don't have a face and a name and a story of someone, if you have an affected and a victim or someone who gives you the face and the name of your cause, it will give you even more possibilities to succeed. People will talk about it over dinner. People will get offended, and if you can't connect their fears and their emotions, I totally agree with Brett around it. You have to try to connect emotions around. You could be the next possible victim, or you could know someone in this particular situation. People will even answer to your call of action if you have them. So every cause could be even more successful if you have a face and a name, and even more if that particular person is willing to speak up, and if they're willing to go to media and give interviews. We even prepared all of these discriminated people in Mexico. We gave them media trainings. We explained them how journalists work around when the interviews are being taken, and they're fearless. They are activists, and they love to fight for their right to health. So it's very important, even more, if they are willing to speak up.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. You know, like there's a number of examples you can think of in budgets. So, for example, if you want to talk about education budgets, you could go and profile a teacher who's spending her own money to buy supplies for the children because there's no supplies. Or you could go and profile a poor school and a rich school and talk about why is there a difference, and how the budget, show a visual about where the money goes, and why is there such a difference, and what does it mean for the children at school. So there's any number of ways that you can actually really humanize the issue and make it really concrete for people. Or profile a mother of children who's trying to get by on a small amount of money every month, and what it means and where the money goes to, and so what this extra tax or what this kind of small addition to her monthly grant, where it's going to go, and show how that's not enough. So there's any number of ways you can do that.
Mm-hmm. That's correct. I agree.
Are there other comments or reactions or questions? If anybody's working on a media campaign at the moment and would like to share some of the challenges that they're going through.
So there was a question on the chat about what has your roles been in liaising with Ministries of Finance in advocating part of the national budget? So I don't know. I just want to say there as well that I think, one other role that you can play, particularly when it's sort of budget, national budget time, and the finance minister's announcing the budget, is often actually just to brief journalists beforehand and to say, here are some questions you should be asking. That can be really helpful. Have a briefing with journalists about what are the current issues and what they should be asking. And that can be very useful, particularly because, again, often journalists go in and ask questions that have to do with business, with the economy in general, but not necessarily poor issues and what it means for poor people or working class people. And if you can empower them with some background, you can actually get those questions asked. I've actually sat in Parliament in South Africa with the journalists when the minister's releasing the speech. And because it's mainly people asking about capital gains tax and what it means for millionaires, that's what he's responding to and has to justify, and no one's asking the questions about what it means for the. And so if you can put some journalists in there to ask those questions, the minister then has to justify the policies in those terms.
And I would like to say something. Sometimes when the ministers present the budget, the project, I agree with Brett. Sometimes sending questions to the journalists would be great, but also you have to take a quick reading of it and try to send some heads up to the journalists. Sometimes you can even fix something before it's been approved, or even before it's discussed, if it goes public, and not necessarily it's you who have to go and speak up or have the message transmitted through you. If it's strategic, well, go ahead and give a press conference, perhaps. But if not, well, you can try to lobby or give heads up to some editors. This topic it seems like it's not, and if it's a very complicated one, but these budget issues are even more important to media every year, and they will still be growing in interest for the media.
Diana Aubrey has a question as well. She says, thanks for interesting presentations and IVP for hosting this event. My question is from perspective of government's national budget. What has your roles been in liaising with ministries of finance in advocating parts of national budget?
Yeah, that's what we were just talking about, Rocio.
Okay.
I think. Yeah.
I just wanted to read that out loud. I also wanted to emphasize for the thinking of civil society organizations and for the the way of transmitting the research and focusing on the advocacy phase of the work, knowing how the media in your context operates is critical, and thinking of the media as a tactic that can serve different purposes is critical. I just wanted to emphasize that point that Brett made in his presentation of the different purposes that the media serves, and that sometimes there are unintended outcomes when approaching and using the media. And I wanted to see if Brett, Memo, and others could just share some of those unwanted outcomes or byproducts of engaging with the media, because I think that it's important, when using the media, to think of what you want to do and what your goal is, and how that advocacy piece links to your research, etc. But you also have to be prepared with what happens next, and what are some of the consequences or the effects of your media outreach. It might be that you pick up enemies along the way, or you find allies after you engage with the media, or it could be that people cover one side of your story that you were not trying to focus on. There's different things that could happen, and you have to be prepared also when approaching the media on the different outcomes afterwards. So if there's any comments or reactions on that, I think that's also relevant for our work.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's so important, Rocio, and I think one important thing to bear in mind as well is that in many places, just be careful when you're around journalists. Be careful of what you say, because often, you're making official remarks, but actually they're also listening to everything else you say. And sometimes, that comes out. We did a training for journalists in, I think it was Malawi or Zambia, around sort of social protection and social grants. And at some point there was an informal conversation, and the next day there was a headline about, like, this guy from this project slams the government for its HIV policy, and it was an informal chat over lunch, and suddenly it was in headlines in the newspaper the next day. So I think, just be and completely out of context, and then the government's now alienated because they think you're slamming them when you're trying to work with them to implement a policy. So just be very careful again around journalists, that everything you say can be used for or against you. And often then you have to, do you respond or not? I mean, that's often a question. Sometimes it's actually better just to leave it, because it actually will be forgotten in 2 days' time. And that's very much depends on context, whether you need to respond, and correct things, or whether it's better just to kind of let it go by. You have to kind of just learn to, it's a kind of, the more you do it, the more you kind of judge what's best, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I will say that, I will insist, journalists are not our friends, and that doesn't mean that you cannot have friends that have a profession of journalist. But when working, and all the time, journalists are prepared to never stop being a journalist. So if you go out for dinner to a journalist, try not to say anything you will regret, or anything you won't like to see published the next day. That's something we have learned in the most horrible way, with bad experiences. We need to understand that every news company, every media company, they all have agendas. And when they go out and they call you for a reaction, they are seeking, they're fishing, they're trying to get someone to tell them what they need to publish sometimes. So they have an agenda. You must have an agenda. When you try both, that could be great, but try not to say, this is often a very huge problem. Try not to say what they want you to say, but try just to stick to your message and try to say what you want to say and what you want to see published the next day. This is very important, because sometimes we develop like friendship with journalists, and we think we're having a conversation, we're being interviewed. So try to keep this in mind.
I think also, the impact on the people that are featured. We've talked a lot about featuring real people and their stories, and I think it's important to brief people and make sure they understand before they agree to that, what it means to be in the media. And some people, as you said, Rocio, it can be unintended consequences. Maybe there's backlash to them because they're speaking out. Maybe suddenly they find their privacy is invaded and they don't like it. They didn't realize it would be that bad. So it's really important to make sure people really understand, that, okay, are you agreeing to this? Do you realize you'll be in the media? This can go anywhere. In these days, in days gone by, it was in the newspaper, and the next day it was gone. But now everything's on the internet. It's there forever. So, I think it's really important. It can go around the, we had an example of a guy from Nigeria who was at the AIDS conference in Washington, D.C. a couple of years ago, and he was gay, and he got interviewed by an American newspaper. Someone, Nigerian person, sent it home to Nigeria, and next thing he got, when he went home, he got death threats. So I think those things are really important, and you have to think about them and brief people about them as much as you can, prepare people, and make sure there's informed consent when you're getting people to appear and to agree to be interviewed.
Thank you. There's a question from Lisbeth Dina Jensen. She says, any ideas for how to communicate very high-level issues such as the new UN resolution on investment in children?
I will only have to say if she has any good idea on what's the impact on that resolution on people's lives, that could be good. It doesn't matter. Well, does matter, but if you don't have a face and a name particularly, you will have a number of possible affected people, beneficiaries, or how things are going to change from the status quo to the impact this resolution is aiming. So I would say it's always around how this is going to change people's lives. If it doesn't change people's lives, well, you have to ask yourself if it's relevant for, I don't know, for the history, or if it's relevant for the news, if it's journalistic, something, I don't know if there's a translation from Spanish saying periodístico, if it's relevant only as a new or as something you have to take into account, or if it does truly have an impact on people's lives. I would say that. Thank you.
Go ahead.
Yeah, sorry, I've just forgotten what I was going to say.
Well,
sorry, Rosie, just remind me of the comment.
Lisbeth Dina Jensen is asking how to communicate high-level issues.
Yeah. I can give an example of the Millennium Development Goals, the UN Millennium Development Goals. And we had an example of a guy he got a project with the UN to make this really concrete. And so he went and he sent cameras to people in different countries of the world and focused on different Millennium Goals and said, okay, you go and film me, health issues in your country, and some people in rich countries and some people in poor countries, and then put that together to show, for example, what it meant, access to, like a pregnant woman giving birth in Indonesia versus one in Switzerland, for example. So show that very concretely what it meant. I'm thinking another example is things like the Global Fund on HIV, TB, and malaria. It's funding treatment around the world, and we were trying to advocate for governments to continue funding that, for governments to continue donating to the Global Fund. And so we went around and we actually got people to film stories in various countries about what the treatment means to them, how they're alive, what their life means because they can access this treatment. So it takes those really abstract policies and like huge big numbers to the ground and shows like actually these are real people, it's not statistics. These are real people and this is how they're being affected by the money that you're donating, and that they're surviving and they're able to thrive because you've given money for them to have treatment.
In response to Lisbeth's question, Dina Aubrey says, we also tried training journalists, but essentially the media was biased in the country concerned, so it didn't really work. We tried to get around it by working with CSOs and NGOs to get the right messages out.
Yeah, that's a huge issue in many countries where the media is maybe all government-owned and any critical messages cannot get in. Often in countries like that, you might find that there's alternative media, such as online portals that people pay attention to. Or maybe that's where you try and stage an event that a journalist just have to cover because you're staging such an interesting event. That's another issue. But you know, the other thing is that, you know, think about who the journalists do quote, and maybe there's some people that you can get on your side. You know, often the journalists are quoting opposition figures or influential figures in other realms of society, and can you get them to convey your message? So yeah, it is a problem in many places, and something that people just have to be creative about getting around.
Ryan, did you have your hand up?
Sorry, me?
Yes,
I did, but I thought we were probably running out of time. Anyway, I'll ask quickly. It's probably more for Brett. There's sort of a lot of information produced by, say, researchers within our organisations that is relevant for the media, but they're producing it for an audience of, you know, largely researchers write for their peers, people who really know their stuff. As a communications person, how do you make sure you're kind of involved early enough, or able to use that information and rejig it for a general audience? And I guess, do you ever find resistance on the part of researchers in that sense, that some researchers feel like they can say this in this way, but then become quite uncomfortable when you talk about going to the media with what is usually a little bit broader a message? I mean, if anyone who wants to answer is fine, but I thought, Brett, you might have a fair bit to say.
Yeah, so that's often a negotiation, right? And I think I agree with you. Researchers, you know, want, you know, very detailed. They, you know, they hedge their, you know, the conclusions. You know, this is true under these circumstances, but not under these. They, you know, they're very careful and often very uncomfortable when then you say, well, we have to actually get away from that detail and just give the bigger picture. And it means kind of not being quite as specific, maybe stating something in a stronger manner than the researcher is comfortable with, and that's often a negotiation that has to happen. And I think the only way that you can get around it is really show, like, you try and show as you go, like, what the impact is and how it's making a difference. One actually effective way, and not everyone can do this, but for example, is to, you know, one organization or one funder got some, working with grantees who were talking about finance issues in the United States, and they realized they were talking in a way that regular people didn't understand, and so they organized a focus group, and they got these organizations to sit behind the mirror and listen, and realized that people didn't understand what they were talking about, and when they saw that for themselves, then they were more open to a different kind of messaging. So, you know, I think the communication people, again, you're often frustrated because you're brought in at the last minute, but if you can just constantly work and show that you're bringing value and show what the impact is again, and that's why it's important to be specific about what your goal is, so that you can then show again what the impact is. And when people see that you're making a difference, they tend to then involve you more and be more open to your way of approaching things.
Great.
I would like to say something or comment something. Around Diana, our question, well, we face in Mexico, all the time we face media or journalists that they have a political interest or they have an economical interest, and sometimes they don't even show up for the press conference, or if they show up, they go just only to see as eyes or to try to get a different perspective in order to, well, sell the story in favor of the government, for instance. But this happens all the time, and we're even used to it. So what we do is we try not to insist with them to be in our side. We try to, well, put more attention on Facebook, on Twitter, on community radios or community media, and still have ways to go and communicate our messages. It doesn't matter. It's normal. We have been, well, it's not normal, but we're used to it. And that's it.
I just want to talk about, going back to your question, Ryan. Another thing is you can have policies in organizations, right? So for every research paper that's produced, we need to get one blog out. We need to send one press release. We need to have a Facebook entry and a Twitter feed. And if you can have that as a policy and get people thinking about, how can they turn this research brief into a number of other kinds of stories and formats, that can be really helpful. Often it's actually like you look at a 50-page research report and you find actually the real story is on like paragraph 5 or page 23. There's something there that's buried there that actually, if you look at it, it can make a great news story. And so can you pull it out and do something with it? But if you have those kind of policies in place, then people make a habit of it. It can be really good. And I just want to highlight a blog that I subscribe to that's really great on this. It's called Think Tanks. I'm posting the URL into the chat. You can get it subscribed so it comes to your email. It's not necessarily about budget issues, but it's about think tank organizations, and often it's about how you can communicate more effectively, and I think it's really useful.
And I would also like to comment around Ryan. It happens all the time as well. Researchers in our organizations, well, they go very deep into the problems, and sometimes, we all feel we cannot leave anything out when communicating because we feel it's obscene or it's not correct. We even have problems inside my organization when it comes to round numbers, when it comes to sound bites. And what we have done is take researchers to media trainings, take them to the stories, try to give lots of training and try to make them understand that it's okay to write a huge paper around a certain topic, but when it comes, for instance, on writing a press release, we have fought a lot. It's like a war inside the organization because some in the communication staff wants, as it has to be, one-page press release, and the researchers feel we're leaving out everything. So anyway, this happens, this is normal, but still lots of, as Brett was saying, perhaps these sessions, when they realize people have no idea what they're trying to communicate, it's better and make them feel that it's necessary to sacrifice sometimes accuracy, as I was saying, to build a soundbite or a message that can and will be communicated effectively.
If there's no more questions from the floor, I'm just going through the list. I don't see any hands up. If there's no more questions or comments for our presenters, I will leave Brett and Memo to give final remarks.
Memo, over to you.
Well, I will start. Well, first of all, thank you for the invitation, Rocio and WP, and thank you, Brett, and thank you for the patience. I've been having problems with my computer, and anyway, this is a very important issue, and I want to underline this. Organizations feel, we feel that all the work we do is relevant, and we have to go out, we have to go public, and we have to communicate all the time. And that's not necessarily true. And we need to understand how the public opinion is working, what is going on right now, and sometimes we need to even wait for public opinion to be not crowded. It won't be crowded. It won't be not crowded, but sometimes topics around public opinion. Sometimes there's a wave. Sometimes we can even be more competitive on that. But inside the organizations, there's a discussion you must have. When going out, going public is necessary, and you need to plan. Perhaps you need to go out in the International Women's Day and try to put some data that is very relevant on the debate. And well, try not to feel bad if you don't control all your message. The pro-life example, pro-vida example, means that if you have good research, if you have good findings, well, if you don't control your message, not all the time will go bad. The tongue gate, it's a very good example of it. And well, thank you everyone, and thank you for the patience.
Yeah, thank you. For me, it was great to chat with everyone and to have Guillermo. I really loved your presentation as well with those great examples. You know, I think just my closing message will just be like, you know, it's incredibly important. Communications often is the last thing everyone thinks about, but really it should be, you know, it should be really, you think about it from the start. And how can you communicate not only with media, but how can you communicate your results to have an impact? No one wants to be doing research and producing great work with no one paying attention or not having impact, and media exposure is crucial to that. So really think about it and how can you integrate it, and how can you kind of make more use of it. And it actually can be fun because you can, this is the time where you can actually be creative and enjoy it. So yeah, that's all I would say right now.
Thank you again, Brett and Memo, and thank you everybody for joining us today. I just want to remind you that both presentations and the recording of this session will be available on the IVP website shortly. And I encourage you to please fill out the survey that will pop on your screen as soon as we finish this session. I wish you all an excellent rest of the day, and thank you very much, and see you next time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Rocio.